Well, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you guys for coming this morning. Um, this won't take a ton of time, but basically a couple of weeks ago as this whole coronavirus thing started, we had a few discussions at the state level, and we've been talking about basically just any meaningful projects that that we could help with, or that we may need to get started, that we could hand to you guys, that would allow you or someone on your staff to work on some stuff that will, make some improvements. That'll be something that'll be meaningful to help the program get ahead or help you guys kind of get ahead. And this was one of the projects that we discussed doing. Basically, we've had a standard file format for the audit section of the file for a very long time. And we've had discussions about having a standard file format for the rest of the file, but we've never made anything official. And so the thinking was that if we took a little bit of time and kind of finished that and made a standard file format, then we could hand it to everybody. And if it's something that would be valuable to you, and if you have anybody on your staff that has a little extra time and could work on it, that it could possibly be one of those projects that, might be something you could spend a little time on now, and it could pay dividends in the long run. So I spent a little bit of time on it. Basically, I went back through some of my notes, some of the feedback I got from people that I was asking about, over the last couple of years. I went through client file checklists from some agencies, and most importantly, I went through our guidelines, and I basically put this list together. And this list represents every document that is required to be in a client file when it's done. So you may have some additional documents that you regularly use, and you won't see them on this list. This is just a list of everything that is required. And I just wanted to take a second and read the language that I wrote at the top of this document, just so everybody kind of understands what the purpose of this document is. So I wrote, it says, this is the recommended file format for the Utah Weatherization and Energy Crisis programs. All of the items listed here are required to be in their respective file whenever they're applicable. Agencies are encouraged to follow this format as closely as possible to allow for standardization of training and processes across the program. Agencies can modify this format to maximize the efficiency of their internal processes. So first and foremost, you do not have to use this standard file format. But we would encourage you to use it. As a best practice, we would love it if you would use it. And you don't have to follow it exactly. If it's going to make you inefficient in some area, or if you need to rearrange something because of the way something's already structured at your agency, by all means do that. We don't want this to become something that creates more work or creates problems for you. So with that being said, I wanted to take a little bit of time and just go through, maybe give you a little bit, talk about some of the things I put on here, and kind of give you some idea of why they're there, or what the thinking was behind them. And then at the end, I would love some feedback from you guys. Let me know if any of these things is going to cause a problem for you. And if it is something, it may cause a problem for one or two of you, and we may have to leave it alone. If it's causing problems for everybody and it's something we could adjust, then I'd love to, after this meeting, make some final adjustments, and then we'll put this out instead of as a draft. We'll put it out as the final or official copy. So let's see, I just got to check my notes to see if I've missed anything so far. Okay, so I've broken this up into 4 different sections. I'm going to just talk about the weatherization file first. And I've noticed that different agencies use different terminology for these 4 different sections. But almost across the board, we all have these 4 different categories that seem to be used right now. We have a category for intake or for the application process or whatever. And that basically is all the paperwork that we would do before we go out and start conducting an audit. So based on what's in our field guide, you've got to have an application. You've got to have client eligibility. Now, when I put the audit file section together, and I guess I need to say something about the audit file section. The audit file section is required. Right now it is required that every time an audit is completed, that these 12 documents must be in the file. They're required to be in that order, and they're required to use that naming convention. And we don't have any plans of changing that because everybody's doing that right now. And one of the, as it mentioned up here, this allows for standardization of training and processes. But one of the main reasons that we instigated the whole standard file format was actually a few years ago as we were going through audit files. They were all over the place. You know, some of the files would have 3 or 4 of these documents. Some of them would have most, but we had lots of the files just missing documents. And so just as a simple best practice, we put out this list and we put it in an order, and we basically recommended that, you know, if you put it in that order in your on your desktop or in your agency's files, that you should be able to kind of at a glance see if these documents are there or if anything's missing. Here's an example of what that might look like. You know, basically you'd put in each piece once it's completed, and then you can look down the list and say, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, it looks like I have everything there. And then I like to wrap everything up into one PDF when I'm done, and that's what this A00 is, but that's something I like to do. Another thing I wanted to point out here is that these are the recommended documents. And the recommendation is that if your agency has other documents that your agency requires to have in its client or its audit file, that you would just continue the numbering. So our standard file format says you need to have 12 documents, and you can see that in this file there's an additional client ed document that the agency likes to include in their file, so it would be numbered 13. So basically you can take this standard file format, add to it at your agencies, and make sure that all of the other documentation that you guys want to be in your files is also included. The other thing is that just because I have one item on here that says A03 field collection forms, that doesn't mean that this only requires one document or one form to be filled out. In some instances, that section is going to represent 2 or 3 forms that need to be filled out. And what I've noticed from a lot of agencies and what I've done in my own files is I end up using that numbering, make sure I'm using A03, and then as long as I know that I'm going to have 2 or 3 forms that I should see under A03, and that's how I'll know that when that file is complete. But in this case, I've got a field collection form, but then there's also a separate document because it's a hand-drawn sketch or something like that. So those are some of the things that have kind of come out of the process and that I've seen that work really well. And that way, still at a glance, I can see if this file is complete. That's not the only way to determine if a file is complete. Most of you guys have a really good client file checklist that you're using, and that really ultimately is the best way to ensure that the file is complete. But by putting these into a standardized order and using a standard numbering and naming convention, it should make that client file checklist process easier as well, because everything's going to be in order as you go down your checklist, and you'll be able to verify everything's in there when you're done. So that's kind of how it has come about from the audit. And again, we are not changing anything about the audit. At least I don't plan to. We can talk about it if it would help. But because we are entrenched on the audit, everybody's using it. I didn't make any changes to this section as I went through this. But with that, let me go back up to the intake section. Under the intake section, these are the things that are required to be in there. You've got, and I did I for intake, and then 1 would be the application. I2 is the client eligibility. And then this is where, the paths split a little bit or diverge a little bit, where if they're heat qualified, then for client eligibility, you only need a heat certificate in the file. But if they're DOE qualified, then you actually need the client eligibility form or their income form to be filled out. And then you need a separate document which is proof of residency or citizenship. And so I've numbered all of that as I02, and this is where a good client file checklist would have to come in and kind of fill in the gaps. So I took a client file checklist, and I basically on I02, I've listed exactly what it says in the standard file format. And then underneath that, I've listed, okay, a heat certificate, and then a DOE client eligibility and proof of residency. And on my client file checklist, which if it would help, if this is something you guys would like, once I finish it, I can send it to you. I've tried to add in a little bit of logic. So if I click on heat, it could kind of shade out or make those disappear so that you don't need them. You just need the heat certificate. Or if I click on both, it gives me an error. If I click on just the DOE, then it's showing that I need these 2 things as I'm going through my list. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. The main point there is that all of these things would be labeled I02. And that's where they would end up in the file, is in that, that part of the file, to make sure that you have everything and it's all in the right order. A lot of the rest of the things aren't, that there isn't multiple documents. Well, not a lot of them are, but there are still some other things. So home, age, and ownership. Sometimes that's 1 document, sometimes it's 2 or 3 in order to verify both of those things. Your utility release should be 1 document, but your utility history could be a couple of different documents from different utility providers. Energy burden and priority points, I think that right now is a 1 workbook. Applicant health and safety evaluation, and your any client correspondence, and an approval letter. If you have some written correspondence that goes back and forth, you want to put that there, and everyone should have some sort of an approval letter letting them know when they are approved for weatherization. But anyway, that's the intake process. The audit process I won't go through because it's kind of set. Production, you should have your work orders, and then sometimes there's going to be some furnace forms. This is another thing where in the audit, there were 2 documents that you don't necessarily have to have in there, but we set a standard just to help everybody kind of establish some good habits or a best practice. The first one is the lead inspection report. If the home is built after 1978, you don't have to do a lead inspection. But we have so many homes that we work on that are built before 1978, and it's a big risk to the program if we miss that. And so we just made it required that every single time you put together an audit file, you're going to include a copy of the lead inspection report in it, no matter when the home was built. And then we just put a box right at the top of the lead inspection form that somebody could check and acknowledge that the home was built after 1978 and that the lead inspection was not required. So every one of the audit files has this form in it, and a lot of them just say it wasn't necessary, and they acknowledge that it was built after 1978. The same goes for this SHPO form. So as a best practice, that's what we did for the audit. You can kind of decide what would work for your agency. When it comes to furnace forms, if you don't touch a furnace when you're weatherizing this house, you may not put any forms in there. If your client file checklist is set up to where, you know, it's going to help you see or acknowledge that there was no furnace worked on, then you wouldn't need to put any furnace forms in there. But every time you do work on a furnace, then you need to fill out the appropriate forms, and in some cases you need to fill out one form. In some cases you need to fill out one or two other forms. So as you're thinking about this, make sure that your processes help with this. I think a lot of you have already got them developed, but just something to think about there, and just to point out where you guys have the flexibility to make this work for you. You don't have to do what we did with the audit. You can just not put them in there if that works best. But yeah, work orders, furnace forms, production, worst case draft test. There should always be a worst case draft test during production when you are making any adjustments to the pressures of the house, which is most of the time. Production CO analysis, if you work on any of the combustion appliances, then there should be some combustion tapes that are included there. And then any lead safe work documentation. So again, this is one that you wouldn't have in every file, but if you have to do lead safe work, it is required. So those are the things that we should see in production. And closeout. And closeout, I've seen different terminology for this. The QCI seems to be involved with most of this stuff. At some agencies, you may pass off. Once the QCI is done, you may hand this file to somebody else to complete that. And if you needed to break this into a couple of sections to, so that people could maintain ownership of what they need to do, you could definitely do that. But basically, when the file is complete, it needs to have a copy of the BWR, copy of the signed weatherization partnership agreement, a QCI inspection form, QCI photos, post-weatherization blower door, final ash rate calculation, all of your inventory, invoices, and receipts, client completion report, which is all of your jobs costed out by each measure. So it's either your client completion report or some of you are using a form called job cost by measure, post-weatherization worst case draft test, and your final CO analysis. So I'm going to stop right there at this point and ask you guys for any questions, concerns, feedback just on the weatherization file itself. What comments have you guys got? Is this going to cause any problems with what you're currently doing that we could help with? Would something like this be helpful? Or does it look like it would work?
What are you considering the weatherization partnership agreement? Sorry, I might have missed that when you were talking about it.
That's okay. Will you repeat that? Is that Carrie Lynn?
Yeah, so in your closeout file, your item number 2 is called your weatherization partnership agreement. What is that?
Okay. It's something that's been in our guidelines for a while. It's basically an agreement between the agency and the client. Let me see if I can look it up really quick. That is basically the client kind of agreeing to, you know, to follow some of the client ed and things like that, if I'm not mistaken. So let me see if I can find that form. So final inspection and partnership agreement right here on our resources page.
All right, that's where I got lost. We call it final inspection, so it's all one form then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's,
I'm good.
yeah, so that's what we're looking for there. And anyway.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Yeah. What other questions have you guys got or thoughts? All right. It's fairly quiet. I'm going to go on to the next part. And this is something where, so this year as Dalton and I were out doing our technical monitoring, we made sure to pull a crisis file from every agency. And we've noticed that the crisis files are not as organized as the weatherization files, or that there's a few more variations in the crisis files than the weatherization files. And so it would be wise of us at this point to actually standardize the crisis file and kind of put together some sort of a list of what's supposed to be in there. I did go through the crisis section of our guidelines, made sure that everything that is required and everything that's listed there is now represented here. There was one thing that we added that it's currently not written in our guidelines that you have to do, but at the state level we realize we need you to do it, and we're going to add it to the guidelines. And that was that we need some sort of a final inspection form. I think some of you are already doing it because you realize the QCI doing a final on weatherization file is just as important to have this, somebody go out and do a final inspection on your crisis jobs. But this is what I came up for the crisis file. At a bare minimum, we need some sort of intake, so you're going to have application and eligibility, and we do have to verify the age and ownership of the home. We need to verify the age, so that we know whether or not we need to do lead testing and whether or not we need to do SHPO. Typically, most of the stuff we do in a crisis does not trigger SHPO, but lead is the more important thing there. And then ownership, we just have to have the right to enter and alter. The assessment, which is, basically like the audit, but it's not. There should be some assessment notes. You do need to be documenting when you went to the house, what was going on, why the client is eligible to receive whatever measures you're going to install. So similar to an audit, what would come out of that should be some sort of a list of things you're approving and the reason why you're approving that. Any photos, a lead inspection report where applicable, worst case draft test, if it's a combustion appliance which you're touching, which usually it is if it's a crisis, and CO analysis, and then any SHPO stuff if you need to do that. Production's going to be, go ahead.
When you're talking about SHPO for crisis, are you just is the worry there about the lead or about changing the structure of the home?
SHPO is always changing the historical aspects of the home. And so it's not too often that you would be doing a crisis that would trigger SHPO because, if you'll use the SHPO, the same SHPO form that you use in the weatherization file, most of the time, if the home is older than 50 years, you'll be indicating that whatever work you're doing is on the Appendix A, Appendix A work, that basically you're doing a furnace, you're going to have a new venting system coming out of the roof, but the national and state SHPO agreed that doesn't violate, or that doesn't require a 106 review. So was there something
Okay.
from Ian or somebody else? And again, these are things that are required when they're applicable. But you know, we've tried to make this list as complete as possible so that you're accounting for all of these things. Production looks pretty much the same. You know, you would typically have some work order of some sort. Furnace forms when you work on a furnace, worst case draft and CO when you work on combustion appliances, and lead safe work if there's any lead on any of the stuff you're touching. That you know, triggers the lead safe. There may be a little bit of lead, but if it is not more than the 6 square feet or the de minimis or whatever that term is, then you know, it may not trigger that. And then your closeout, you're going to have a BWR. And then you'll notice between the closeout on the weatherization file and the closeout on the crisis file, the terminology is different. I'm not using the term QCI. We're using final inspection. Just to differentiate between a crisis file, just to keep clear that the person that's doing a final inspection on a crisis job is not required to be a BPI certified QCI. We don't want, like, I think it's a good practice if you do that, but if it, you know, we want to make sure you guys are just kind of can see those differences between the two different programs we're running. So final inspection form, inspection photos, worst case draft, CO, and then your inventory, invoices, and receipts on that one. Am I missing anything there, or is there anything there that you're not sure why it's there or anything like that? And then my other big question on this one is I really went back and forth on how to standardize this one or how to number this one. On the intake, it doesn't really matter because, you know, these first 3 items are the same here and here. And I know that there's going to be a lot of jobs where you guys are working on a crisis file, or sorry, you're going to weatherize the home. And so it's kind of nice to kind of copy and paste either one way or the other so that you're going to have these same documents in both files. And so my thinking was that if they're numbered the same, that may reduce the amount of extra clicking and extra work that it would take to create these files. But then the wheels come off as you go down the list. Like when it comes to the audit, the numbering does not line up with this numbering. So it would require you to do extra clicking. One thought is that instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a row, that we could just match the numbering exactly with the weatherization file. And then, you know, you guys would just learn over time that you would need documents 1, 2, 8, 9, 10, and 11, or something like that. And then the same thing goes, I think production kind of mirrored the file, but closeout is all over the place as well. So, and then the other thing that if we keep the numbering in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right, in order, then I'm wondering if using the same letters and the same terms would cause problems where your number 4 in a weatherization file would be QCI photos, but the photos over here would end up being number 3. So, you know, one thought is that we just number these using a C for crisis file and number the whole list, or put a C in front of the I and, you know, something like that. But anyway, would love some feedback from you guys on that if you have any.
I wouldn't want to see a whole lot of extra stuff in there that doesn't need to be in there.
What do you mean? Tell me more.
Like when you said line up the numbers with the audit file of the weatherization side, you know, you're going to end up putting a lot of stuff in the crisis file that doesn't really need to be there.
Oh, I gotcha. So my thinking there wouldn't be to say, you know, start putting in more documents. It would be that we would number. So instead of having them just in a consecutive numbering order, A01 would be kind of your assessment notes, but then I would change this one. Instead of being A02, I would just change that to AO through AO4, sorry.
Oh, yeah, that'd be all right, I guess.
And then this one would be A08, and so on down the line. Just simply so that when you're copying them over, you're not having to renumber stuff. But I'm making assumptions about you copying them over. I don't really know how much of that gets copied and pasted and how much of it end up getting reproduced because it's different.
Or would they just go in and make the standard file format and just copy that same format again and again and again for a new client? Like, would they be able to just do it once?
What do you mean?
Like, so when I've gone in and made files, I'll just kind of like, so like on my monitoring ones, I have my monitoring file for that agency, and I got the program years laid out, and then under each program year I've got monitoring letters, monitoring photos, and that type thing, and then I just keep copying over for the next year those files, I guess, so that it's laid out the same from year to year to year.
Yeah.
So like once they did, would they really need to be copying each time, or would they just make that? Could they make it once?
Well,
leave the form blank,
I think
copy it. You know what I mean? Keep
I'm trying to pull up an example of what you might be talking about.
Yeah.
I've noticed that I think 5 County is probably the agency that comes to mind. I've noticed that you guys have a bunch of empty folders that you kind of use this file format, and you have empty folders for every one of these things. Is that what you're talking about, Dalton, where you kind of copy over the empty folders?
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, could you do that with if you had like empty forms? Can you do the same thing with forms or not? Is it just?
I have noticed, so I actually would caution against doing some of that stuff. And the reason why, I've noticed that there's a bunch of files that I go through when the agency is doing that, where they have, and they'll have a bunch of those folders, and it's really not the folders, it's really when they copy in all the blank forms. I've noticed a lot of the time those blank forms are not filled out. And when you're opening up a file and you're glancing at it, it's like, hey, this one's, you know, it's there, so it must be done.
Yeah.
Just make sure that your practices are set up so that you're,
because I guess the way I'm doing it, it is just files, and then I go and put the documents in, you know, in each applicable file. But
yeah.
But when you're talking about putting all the documents in together, it may not work that way.
Yeah. You could definitely have a separate folder where you put all of the blank forms, and then as you fill them out, you could move them over or something. But I'm making the assumption that because let's take a weatherization job where during the weatherization process, we identified that there was a crisis opportunity to replace the furnace. And so now we need, and we've had discussions where you can clearly identify that in the weatherization file, and that's sufficient, or you can make a separate crisis file. And I've noticed a lot of agencies are actually making separate crisis files.
And I think
I've made the assumption that
Brad kind of
if I was making that, I've made the assumption that if you're making that separate crisis file, that one might go into the weatherization file and grab a copy of the photos, and just copy them over into the crisis file instead of going through all those photos and cutting them down just to the 1 or 2 photos that might pertain to this. they might just grab all of them, which I think is fine. You know, that thinking might change over time, but right now I don't want to create a whole bunch of extra work for you guys. So anyway, the thinking is just that you'd probably copy your field collection notes over and your audit and photos over and your lead inspection report and your worst case draft. You'd just simply be grabbing a copy of them and pasting that into your crisis file. And if that is what you're doing, then, you know, if we had these numbers exactly the same as the audit file, then you wouldn't have to pause and renumber them. But, and again, you can modify this however it works best for you, but if anybody out there is looking at this and going, Matt, why are you numbering it this way? Like this, it would be so much easier some other way. I'd love to talk about it, you know. If I'm doing something that would really create a lot of problems, not just at your agency, but across the board, you know, speak up and give me a little bit of feedback here. Does anybody have a strong opinion or have any thoughts or any other questions?
If our vote for the crisis file would be to do 1 through 6, just for the same reason that we do 1 through 12 on weatherization. It's easier for us to look and go, yes, they're all there. And as we've talked in here, we'd rather change a number, because if we keep the naming similar, we're only considering changing numbers in order to line it up if we're moving them between files. So that would be our vote.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anybody else? All right, and one of the reasons why I am asking for feedback, where this is open-ended, this is something you guys can use and kind of alter however you want. What I've noticed though is whatever we do put out as the standard, it will end up, the majority of people will use that as the standard. And like the audit, once it is written, it kind of gets set in stone. It's really hard to change. So if anybody else is thinking something different, please speak up now. Otherwise, I'll probably do what Carrie Lynn just mentioned. Anybody have any other feedback? All right, I'm here in silence. If you do have any other feedback and would prefer to just talk offline about it, I'm just working from home. I'm available all day. Please feel free to email me or call me. I'd be glad to chat about it. I really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts on it. But otherwise, let's go ahead and end there. I'm going to send this out as the recording out just for other people who want to see it. But I'll probably just wait till the first part of next week and we'll publish a final draft of this and send it out. I hope that it will be useful to some of you, and if it's not or you've already got stuff dialed in, don't worry about it. So thanks so much for all that you guys are doing, and stay healthy.
Thanks, Carter.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.